Gunnar. So Gunnar just pointed out the degree to which blockchain can bring about enormous positive change. Swytch is a renewable energy token that's designed to accelerate the transition to clean energy. Now, there's no bigger problem on Earth that everyone agrees with than climate change and the need to accelerate these things, but it turns out there's difficulty in the way. Everything I'm about to share with you today exists. This is a real company with about a gigawatt and a half already operational. When we talk about the climate change issue, it turns out everyone agrees that it's a problem we need to solve, but a lot of the governance mechanisms to bring about quick change or to bring about energy change don't exist. If you were to be at Davos this year, Klaus Schwab's opening letter said the global commons cannot protect itself. Here we have all of these globalized policies, but we're not sharing the obligations. It basically is a way of saying we don't have the governance mechanisms to accelerate things. It's a plea for something new. Let me share with you kind of what's going wrong in the move towards renewable energy. Well, first of all, a lot of the existing government incentives you might have heard of that would build wind power, say, incent the wrong things. They'll, for example, pay you to build a wind power plant, but it might sit there and do nothing because the incentives really aren't about putting it on production. That's not a smart contract. That's actually a dumb contract because it doesn't adapt in real time. It also turns out individuals are often shut out. If you have rooftop solar, you can't participate in all this. And when you do participate in these government programs, the utility might take 30%. Is this starting to sound familiar? Also, you'd think there'd be lots of information about what's going on in renewables so people could make smart decisions about what to trade off. But a lot of that data ends up going by fax or by hand, or it's self-reported. I made 5 kilowatts. But that devalues it, and it turns out everybody in this industry would love there to be better data. So it turns out, if you were to listen to the industry or our Davos friends, what they're telling you is, we need something that's distributed. And we need more immutable data that we can believe in, that we can build something on, and it has to work in real time. Distributed, immutable, real time. Do you see where this is going? The whole conversation is essentially a plea for what we're talking about here at d10e, for something that can respond in this manner. And that's what we're building at Swytch. Now, as an incentive, the first thing we do is we're awarding more tokens the more alternative energy that is produced. So if you're a utility doing geothermal or solar or wind, the more you get. But it turns out that's not even the best objective function for the world. What you want to solve for is the more carbon displaced. Because the problem is that it may well be that you're producing energy in California, but if you were to produce renewable energy in Puerto Rico and displace diesel, you'd be doing even better. So that's what Swytch is, that kind of mechanism. Now, when you think about it, what we're bringing to market is a proof of production protocol. So if Bitcoin operates on proof of work, where the way you prove you're doing something hard is you burn energy and then you kind of heat up all of those chips. In our case, what generates the work is the production of alternative energy. The more energy that's produced, the more value that's created. So instead of consuming energy and producing carbon, we produce energy and don't use carbon. So that actually creates a new kind of more cleaner environment that is scalable and can move forward. And by the way, this exists today. Our first proof of concept has come online in Germany and Austria with geothermal, with solar, and with wind, and it's about 1.5 gigawatts. Now, it turns out Germany is a great place to work in because they have the biggest regulations in the world, things like how do you double account for incentives and stuff. If you can get it right there, you can start getting right in many, many places. Here's another point. As I mentioned before, you don't want to just incent the creation of energy. You really want to incent the displacement of fossil fuel. The name of this game is bring on more clean production, but how do you bring off other stuff? So right now, for example, it's easy to raise money for these things in California, so much so that in the middle of the day, they will pay you to take their electricity away. Whereas in Puerto Rico, as Brock pointed out earlier, we're burning diesel. In fact, 250,000 gallons a day just for water. So what you want to do is have an incentive which generates more value and more tokens the more fossil fuel you're displacing. This has the effect of essentially moving investment to the developing world and to the global south. In a way, you could say there are only two problems in moving us along to renewables. The first is regulatory lag. All of these incentives come and go. They're subject to political winds. They expire. They're not a global marketplace. They're not shared. That's one thing we offer. And then the second is, in a lot of the developing world where you need this stuff to hit carbon goals, there isn't the capital. But something like this can create value, and it can be financed. How is that done? Well, it's a dynamic oracle. By incenting power producers to share information, you have a real-time view of what's going on, and then what you're able to do is, based on fossil and other generation, award more token to where it does more good. We're building this with some of the world's top critical infrastructure companies. That is to say, we're building it with people who have built Hawaii's grid and other grids like that. So, up top, partnerships with 4 major cities. We're working, turns out our initial financing's from Korea. Cities want to displace pollution. We're working with a number of them. Black & Veatch and Lend-Lease build, operate, and maintain the world's largest power plants. That next layer of partners are people who actually gather up a lot of this data. And then at the blockchain level, we're working with people who are able to build this kind of oracle mechanism that I described. That creates an economy where on the consuming side, cities, individuals, and companies that care about carbon displacement are involved. And on the production side, anyone that makes energy. You're probably thinking, here comes another guy telling me he's building a token economy. Has anything like this ever happened before? Well, one of our first investors is Steve Jurvetson, the same guy who was the first money into Tesla. And I was talking to him at South by Southwest the other day. He gave me this analogy.
And then one that's, of course, dear to your heart, Swytch, which is really fascinating, and maybe more than any other that I've seen, opened my eyes to how broad the industry applicability of this is. As you know from asking you about Tesla, and we also were the largest investors in Solar City and Enernoc. These were all companies that were looking at ways of ushering in a future of clean and green technologies. And in many cases, there's a huge transaction cost to interoperating with the rest of the economy, whether it's the zero emission ZEP credits that the Tesla deals in and brokers between large companies, whether it's what Enernoc does with demand response, or what Solar City does with being the largest solar installer in the world. We were aware of this whole data layer and this whole services layer that was broken, and when you and your team painted this picture of how it could be done on the blockchain, it sort of, the light bulb went off that this would solve many of the problems of distributed sort of monitoring and trade of what's fundamentally a broken system today in terms of transaction costs.
So the plan is we're starting with a lot of these large producers, but this becomes something that becomes consumer. If you have a rooftop, this becomes a credit or a game. Remember the old I Want My MTV campaign? We think people are going to man their Swytch. Now, there's a lot of, by the way, you can see this energy space is ripe for disruption. And there are a number of people in the kind of blockchain energy space. The big difference is many of the other ones are about actually trading energy from a microgrid to a microgrid or actual physical electrons. This is a mechanism that goes across all utilities. So to give you a sense for scale, other folks in the space talk about 1 or 5 or maybe 500 million watts under management, and we start with about 1.5 gigawatts. So we think there's a scale play here. We're raising 60 million. A fair amount of that's been raised through the private sale so far. Importantly, only 10% of the tokens are part of this initial offering. The rest of them are the reward, the incentive for the creation of clean energy. And of course, the more earlier you become in the system, the more value you get. That's the game, to get everybody to play, to bring us to this renewable future. It's a great team. People come out of the energy trading industry, John Clippinger from MIT, and our advisors are terrific. People from the critical infrastructure world, the renewable world, and the IoT world. And I mentioned Steve Jurvetson. d10e has been working with us. This is a network token to provide staking across cities, so we're working with Galea from Bancor. So to wrap up, I'm just going to give the final word to Steve Jurvetson to kind of give you a sense for the real-world problem this can solve.
Right, of all the things one could do on the planet, whether you take a very cynical Copenhagen consensus approach or take just a common person's approach to this, how do you know where the most bang for the buck exists? And you see, unfortunately, in some green energy projects, as we saw firsthand in wind, When the incentives get out of whack, you'll have all kinds of wind turbines built in California, for example, that are spinning idle, right? They're not going anywhere. They're not wired to anything because they got their credits for building the capability,
exactly
not
right.
for actually doing something useful. This would naturally accommodate for all that to give you global prioritization. It's almost like being a market maker in a very distributed sense for data streams that were formerly fractured.
This is, we think, a very large market. It's perfectly built for what we're doing. It's distributed, it needs immutable data, it's taking something global, and it speeds up change, the most important problem on Earth, transitioning to cleaner energy and climate. Thank you for your attention. We're Swytch. Thank you.